Lord, the Roman hyacinths are blooming in bowls, and the winter sun creeps by the snow hills. The stubborn season has made stand. My life is light, waiting for the death wind, like a feather on the back of my hand. Dust in sunlight and memory in corners, wait for the wind that chills toward the dead land. Grant us thy peace.
2006's Children of Men is one of those movies that pretty much everyone seems to admit is a modern classic, leaving its viewers not only deeply impressed, but also deeply moved. A lot of dystopian movies have been coming out lately, but this is one of the only ones that affects everyone positively, which I guess means it must contain those universal themes that great movies are supposed to have, which makes them resonate with everybody. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's not really a genre picture. It always gets called a science fiction movie, but that's only by virtue of the fact that it's set in the future. It contains little in the way of what we consider futuristic technology, and in fact, most of the aesthetic is basically contemporary England if you stopped advancing and it became decrepit. It's also a rarity in the way that it's a dystopian story in which you never see the Orwellian government other than the odd jackbooted soldier. And Big Brother isn't really the villain of the movie so much as its setting, its deep background. It isn't even really a post-apocalyptic movie in the conventional Mad Max style. It takes place after a cataclysmic event of sorts, but the society hasn't really collapsed so much as it's lost the use of its legs. It's also not really a thriller or an action movie or even a drama, although it incorporates elements of all these genres and pulls them off exceedingly well. You can see this indefinability on full display in the way the movie was advertised. The people trying to sell this film clearly want you to know that it's pretty intense, but have no idea how to cater it to you. Well, at the risk of sounding like a cheesy press release, the only way I can describe Children of Men is that it's a human film. It's a thoughtful and somber look at human hopes and passions and commitments, and it's maybe a bit more accessible than the average moviegoer would find other films that deal with the similar material in maybe a more abstract or unfamiliar way like Blade Runner, because this movie's plot is about something as familiar and comprehensible as having babies. The premise of the film is that all the women on Earth inexplicably become infertile around a decade after the millennium starts, and 2 decades later the decay is really starting to set in. Just about everywhere on Earth has collapsed into a state of wanton anarchy, except for England, which has become a fascist state beyond the BNP's most hopeful daydreams, essentially either refusing immigration to non-natives or relegating immigrants to military-policed prison ghettos. Protesting this abuse is a group of alleged terrorists known as the Fishes, led by the enigmatic Julian, who recruits her old flame Theo Farron, a former political activist turned government desk jockey, to obtain transit papers for one of the illegal immigrants, or Fugees as they're known, named Key. Julian ends up killed in an altercation, and at one of the Fish's safe houses, Key reveals to Theo that she is pregnant with the first new human in almost 20 years. Miriam, the woman traveling with Key, is actually her midwife, and the Fish's original plan was for Julian to arrange for them to be brought to the Human Project, a secretive and almost mythical group of scientists dedicated to solving the problem of infertility. But with Julian dead and her right-hand man Luke in charge, it seems that Key will stay with the Fishes. Theo then discovers that Luke actually betrayed Julian and had her killed so the Fishes would comply with his plan to use Key's baby as a propaganda tool with which he can lead a revolution. Theo, Key, and Miriam flee to the house of Theo's friend Jasper, an aging political cartoonist and hippie idealist. Jasper arranges for them to break into the refugee prison camp at Bexhill, from which they can make contact with the Human Project's ship the Tomorrow with the help of Sid, an immigration cop that Jasper sells pot to. After being separated from Miriam and making the connection with a gypsy innkeeper named Marika, Key finally gives birth in an incredibly powerful scene. The next morning an all-out war breaks out between the Fugees led by the Fishes and the British government. Theo manages to rescue Key and her baby from the carnage and successfully takes her out on a lifeboat to meet the Tomorrow, giving his own life in the process of securing a new life for humanity. I post my review of this movie during Advent because it should be pretty obvious already how much Christmas imagery it uses. Not only is there the general premise of a seemingly miraculous birth that brings hope to the world, There are also a few deliberate allusions within the film. He reveals her pregnancy to Theo in a barn, harkening back to the famous manger scene, as does the fact of her giving birth at an inn in an area crowded with people sent there by an oppressive government to control and keep track of them. The connection between this child and the Messiah are also made apparent. The characters take the Lord's name in vain at interesting times, and in revealing ways.
Jesus Christ.
It's okay. Let me see. Jesus Christ.
And during a powerful concluding scene where the film's allegorized Holy Family, a teenage girl, her baby, and an older man taking care of them who isn't the baby's biological father, walk through a battle zone, and soldiers briefly stop fighting in awe at the sight of a new baby. His presence brings peace, and a few even make the sign of the cross to make the allegory even more obvious. Heck, the movie actually came out on December 25th in America, just to drive the point home. But there's another sense in which this is preeminently a Christmas movie, and I think a lot of people probably miss this because they miss this part of the Nativity story itself. Christmas is about salvation coming both for and from the poor and the downtrodden. Joseph and Mary are a poor couple from a poor country town, and when they have Jesus circumcised at the temple, they bring pigeons as an offering, which the Mosaic law had prescribed for those who were too poor to offer anything else. And thus when the Blessed Virgin visits her cousin Elizabeth and utters her famous Magnificat, she declares that God has cast down the mighty from their thrones and has lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. This is a big part of what is implied in the Gospel account of the infant Jesus being laid in a manger. It stresses his human poverty and lowly social origins. Familiar depictions of this event, which make it look quaint and comfortable, entirely miss the point of what the evangelist is trying to get across here. Jesse Jackson may have been overstating it slightly when he said that the real meaning of Christmas is really about a homeless couple, but he wasn't totally off the mark. By showing us a miraculous birth amidst the squalor of poverty and oppression, Children of Men does communicate Luke's intention quite effectively. But there's a bit more even than that going on here. This is a movie that demands a certain level of interaction from the viewer. The way the movie is filmed makes the audience part of the action in a lot of ways. It is sometimes shot in an almost documentary fashion, down to one extended scene where blood seems to splatter on the camera lens. Actually, this scene has been compared to a video game level, and I think there's something to that in a positive sense. It's as psychologically involving to the viewer as a video game would be. The audio of this movie also forces the viewer into a kind of involvement. After Theo narrowly avoids a coffee shop bombing in the first scene, we hear this loud ringing in his ears. Julian later explains,
"You know that ringing in your ears? That ee? That's the sound of the ear cells dying, like their swan song. Once it's gone, you'll never hear that frequency again. Enjoy it while it lasts."
and we hear that same ringing noise when Julian herself is killed. We ourselves are affected by the same kind of despair as the film's characters.
As the sound of the playgrounds faded, the despair set in. Very odd. What happens in a world without children's voices?
And thus we feel a bit of the same thrill that they must when we finally do hear the sound of children's laughter during the movie's closing credits. But we aren't only called to interact with this film in a psychophysical way, also in a philosophical sense. This is a work of art, and the role and power of art are a subtle theme within the movie. Jasper is a political cartoonist, and his wife Janice was once a photojournalist, until she apparently captured some incriminating images to the British government and was tortured by MI5 and left in a catatonic state. There also appears to be a Byzantine icon in the Palmer household, and Marika's home is filled with old photographs and religious iconography. Images have a certain power within the film itself, but there's an essential condition for them to have their power, and that's their context. For example, both in this film and in the recent disaster movie 2012, there's an effort by the characters to rescue all the great works of art for future generations, but while 2012 unreservedly sees this as a good thing, this movie raises some more interesting questions about that prospect.
I I think that the film gives the best diagnosis of ideological despair of late capitalism, of a society without history. This, I think, is a true despair of the film. The true infertility is the very lack of meaningful historical experience, and that's why I like this elegant point in the film of importing all the works of art. All those classical statues are there, but they are deprived of a world. They are totally meaningless, because what does it mean to have a statue of Michelangelo or whatever? It only works if it signals a certain world. And when this world is lacking, it's nothing. It is against this background, I think, that the film approaches the topic of immigration and so on. By setting the movie in England, only there despair can be felt. England is one of the few countries in the world that doesn't have a constitution, because it can rely on its substance of traditions. You don't need it written. And in such a country, the loss of this historical dimension, the loss of this substance of meaning, is felt much worse.
The scene itself deliberately evokes a lot of questions about the power of art within a tradition. Michelangelo's statue of David is broken, and Theo mentions that his mother used to have a plastic lamp of that statue in her bathroom. Nigel has Picasso's Guernica in his dining room, a perfect example of surrealist art, which takes traditional art and shatters it, in this case as a symbol of war. Present at the Ark of the Arts is a Banksy picture of two policemen kissing, which contains a challenge to traditional sexual boundaries, traditional respect for authority, and even the traditional setting of art itself, since it is, of course, graffiti. And incidentally, there's a lot of graffiti in this movie. Even the music in this scene is prog rock. It's opening with In the Court of the Crimson King, and it ends with a visual quote of Pink Floyd's album Animals. Prog rock, of course, is both the direct successor to classical music, but it's also got kind of a subversive edge to it. But none of this means anything without the backdrop of tradition behind it, not to mention an imminent cultural context. Would the scene which evokes Guantanamo Bay be as disturbing without the knowledge of what had happened there, or without knowing what the German phrase "work sets you free" means, since those are the lyrics to the song playing during that scene? This is a movie that compels you to put it into context by drawing upon your own traditions, both your imminent and immediate context, and your wider metaphysical worldview. A quote from the director himself seems relevant here. He says, speaking of a closing scene, "They exit the Russian apartments, and the next shot you see is this woman wailing, holding the body of her son in her arms." This was a reference to a real photograph of a woman holding the body of her son in the Balkans, crying with the corpse of her son. It's very obvious that when the photographer captured that photograph, he was referencing La Pieta, the Michelangelo statue of Mary holding the corpse of Jesus. So we have a reference to something that really happened in the Balkans, which is itself a reference to the Michelangelo statue. At the same time, we use the sculpture of David early on, which is also by Michelangelo, and we have, of course, the whole reference to the Nativity. And so everything was referencing and cross-referencing as much as we could. But this movie doesn't only call upon you to interpret its imagery in the light of art history and stuff you might remember from a comparative religion course. It also invites you to interpret its content in reference to your own intellectual tradition, to put the movie not only into a historical context, but also an anthropological context. Given your views on human nature, not to mention the nature of reality itself, how do you think humanity would respond to a crisis like universal infertility? This is actually a really good laboratory for thought experiments where you can test all your ideas about what it means to be human. It's not a coincidence that the promised land of this movie is called the Human Project, because that's exactly what it asks you to identify. What is the human project? What is our mission and goal as a species based on who we are? And how do we know? In painting its picture of the human situation, this movie doesn't only draw on the Nativity story, but also on the biblical account of the massacre of the innocents. Jesus' birth, like Moses before him, was marked by a foreign tyrant killing all the male children in a certain area. And indeed, both of them managed to survive this infanticide only by way of a miracle. But this movie depicts a world like the one into which Moses and Jesus came in more than respects than just the fact that there's a massive shortage of babies. England, like Egypt, was also oppressing another ethnic group and relegating it to only one part of the country. And the fishes, like the zealots of Jesus' day, also wanted to take up arms and use force to confute the imperial tyrants. In this respect, Julian is a Christ figure. Like Jesus, she urges those who see the social injustice in the world to abstain from violence in favor of peace. It has been postulated that Judas Iscariot's name came from Sicare, an epithet for the zealots that came from the Roman dagger that they used, and that he may have betrayed Jesus precisely because he wouldn't lead a violent revolution. In that case, Luke's betrayal of Julian would have an even more direct analogy to Judas' betrayal. And of course, what does he shout when she is killed?
Jesus Christ!
And, like in Jesus' time, the simmering tension between the oppressed and the oppressors finally boiled over into an all-out violent confrontation. The slaughter at the end of this movie is reminiscent of the destruction of Jerusalem. In Exodus, the midwives end up thwarting Pharaoh's plans and saving several babies, so the presence of the midwife here is appropriate. She is named Miriam, which reminds us of Moses' older sister, who followed him as he was miraculously carried down the treacherous Nile River and brought to safety and salvation, just as Miriam here accompanies the miraculous bearer of a baby who heralds a new hope. The name Miriam translates into Greek as Mary, so the allusion can also be to the Blessed Virgin. This gives the child's survival at the end of the movie not so much an Exodus feeling as a flight into the wilderness vibe. Moses escaped the desert to flee Pharaoh, while Mary and Joseph fled with Jesus into Egypt to escape the wrath of Herod. Both Moses and Jesus later returned to free their people, and we may presume that little Dylan here also has an exalted destiny. But until then, the people are still left waiting in darkness, and that, of course, is the biblical interpretation of childlessness. It's lost hope. Having a child in Israel always had the possibility behind it that this would be the Messiah. Thus, infertility was a sort of curse. The complete childlessness in this movie would symbolize a complete lack of hope, the sense of having been utterly abandoned by God. But why would childlessness symbolize hopelessness to us today? Really stop and think about that for a second. Why would the fact that there would be no future generations of humans cause people to despair? Probably because it would mean that, as far as most people are concerned, everything would be pointless. One of the perennial challenges to any secular worldview is, what's the point of anything you're doing? There are a variety of answers, not all of them equally satisfying, but a lot of them seem to come down to the idea that while I myself might die and go into non-existence, at least I'll have left a better world for the next generation. Indeed, some people use language that suggests that leaving a legacy, be it artistic, political, or genetic, is in itself a kind of immortality. But if there's no future for the human race, those justifications start to crumble like the playgrounds no one has any reason left to maintain. So here's your first question, class. If you knew the human race was going to die out in the next century or so, would there be any reason for you to keep living the way you're currently living? Would you have any excitement about it anymore? Now consider this also. Isn't the human race as doomed in real life as it is in this movie? Oh, sure, we may have quite a ways longer than 50 years left to go, but even if we survive the end of our planet, the entire universe is destined for heat death eventually. There's that old joke about the astrophysicist who tells a group of journalists that the universe will end in a few billion years, and one of them panics until he realizes that he misheard him. He thought he said it was only a few million years. The humor here comes from the fact that not only will we all be gone by then, which is actually sobering enough in its own right, but the thing is inevitable anyways, and if the scenario of Children of Men fills you with a sense of futility, why shouldn't the scientifically verified certainty of the slow but sure approaching end of all existence fill you with the same nihilism and dread? And if it does, remember that this movie is about the possibility of hope, so ask yourself, what sort of hope is possible in the light of that morbid reality? Well, how do the characters in the movie cope with it?
100 years from now, there won't be one sad fuck to look at any of this. What keeps you going?
You know what it is, Theo? I just don't think about it.
That pretty much sums it up. Most everyone in this society deals with the crisis by not dealing with it at all, by turning inwards and trying to distract themselves by extreme solipsism and introversion. The character of Janice, who was tortured until she became totally unresponsive to the world around her, is a microcosm of her society, so tortured by despair until it finally gives up and withdraws into a state of isolated misery. Jasper lives in the woods, listens to grating Zen music, and smoke strawberry-flavored marijuana in an attempt to feel something. A woman at Theo's workplace keeps baby toys at her desk, as if trying to will herself into believing that there's still some use for them. People go to dog races and cheer as if it matters. Nigel wraps himself in his Ark of the Arts, while his son loses himself in some sort of strange video game, and both of them take pills. In fact, a suicide pill called the Quietus, a name taken from Hamlet's famous monologue, promises a peaceful departure from this world. This, of course, being the ultimate form of escape, as the atheist existentialists assure us. Theo appears to smoke cigarettes in an attempt to commit suicide slowly.
You smoking?
Yeah, it's not working.
Even the music of this culture is a sort of buffer between the listener and the real world.
A blast from the past, all the way back from 2003. That beautiful time when people refused to accept the future was just around the corner.
This is a culture where not facing reality is actively encouraged and approved of. Question: does our society also encourage us not to look too hard at reality, and if so, why? In fact, England, historically known for stretching herself outwards all over the world, now collectively draws itself inwards, excluding anyone not born there. This England isn't racist exactly.
Look, the government will take the baby and parade a posh black English lady as the mother.
Its criteria isn't ideology or religion or race or anything like that. Apparently the only criteria involves where you were born. Maybe there's some perversion of the economic principle of scarcity here. Now that births don't happen anymore, your place of birth is the most precious thing about you. What we see in Children of Men is a society of selfishness. This is a world where people only think, care, or are concerned about themselves and their own selfish pleasure, and somehow comforting themselves as the end slips closer. Even basic social bonds seem to be dissolving, and the backstory of Theo and Julian gives us some hints as to why. They once had a child named Dylan, but he died of the flu, and they broke up shortly thereafter, perhaps when it became clear that neither they nor anyone else was going to have any more children. The death of Dylan seemed to be the end of their union, and their relationship starts to rekindle only after Julian discovers that childbirth is once again a human possibility. In fact, for a movie about childbirth, there's absolutely no sex in it other than a couple of passing references. Even the advertisements seem to lack the lasciviousness that characterizes so much of the marketing that we're familiar with. Marriage specifically seems absent from the movie, and we can infer why on the basis of what Bertrand Russell writes about the biological function of marriage in his book, Marriage and Morals. Quote, "Children, rather than sexual intercourse, are the true purpose of marriage, which should therefore not be regarded as consummated until such time as there is a prospect of children." End quote. If you instinctively resist that assertion, then honestly ask yourself, what do you think would happen to marriage in a world where everyone was infertile? This is something you really need to deal with, given that questions of sexuality are so important today, and the answers we give them are going to shape tomorrow in an inestimably important way. But it always astonishes me how ready people are to plunge into conversations and, more importantly, arguments about sex without first defining what sex is and what purpose it has, if any. These are the kind of things you have to get out of the way before you can intelligently discuss a topic. Now, P.D. James was inspired to write her novel by statistics about how the sperm count in the West had rapidly declined, and by the speculation that this may have been because humanity was approaching its twilight as a species. Incidentally, I see in the news that apparently this is still happening in France, and scientists still aren't totally sure what the cause is, but they chalk some of it up possibly to lifestyle, but that's a separate topic. James herself writes as a conservative Anglican, which no doubt is why her story unconsciously evolved into what she herself described as a Christian moral fable. Its worldview reflects the traditional Christian understanding of sexuality that was largely abandoned by her own communion at the Lambeth Conference in 1930, but is still retained in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, again, remember, we're discussing here what tradition to fit things into, how things don't make sense outside of a tradition, outside of some sort of continuity of ideas. Now, if you want to understand the Church's various positions on sexual morality, which are frequently caricatured and misunderstood by the popular media, you really need to get at this central insight from which all these other arguments flow, or else you're never going to make any sense of them or perceive their inner logic. Basically summarized, the Church affirms that God created man in his own image, both male and female, and gave us our sexuality as a gift with a telos or purpose. Sexual intercourse has two fundamental functions. The unitive, which is bringing in the couple emotionally and psychologically closer together until in some mysterious way they become one flesh, and the genitive, the reproductive function. The fact that this is the primary function of the sexual organs, aka the reproductive organs, seems pretty self-evident, although apparently it isn't to everybody. In coming together to make love, the couple not only bonds together more tightly, but also open themselves up to be collaborators with God in bringing about the existence of a new immortal soul. That's why we call it procreation. It's the preparatory act for God to create a new human person. When done the way it was intended, sex fully images the triune God, consisting as it does of persons in perfect communion. In 1968, in the wake of the invention of the birth control pill, by a Catholic scientist incidentally, and under increasing pressure to change with the times, Pope Paul VI published the encyclical Humanae Vitae, which affirmed the Church's traditional opposition to all forms of artificial contraception. A decade later, Karol Wojtyła, who had been instrumental in developing the encyclical, became Pope John Paul II and probably gave a series of talks on what he called theology of the body, a restatement and development of Catholic anthropology in language drawn from personalist philosophy. The theology of the body emphasizes that the human person is both body and soul, and that the body is a sacrament, the visible sign of an invisible reality, like how a word is a physical manifestation of an immaterial concept. Now, also like words, our bodies can communicate. We know the concept of body language, and can even lie. The conjugal act is a statement of self-giving. When someone tries to have sex without the intention of totally giving themselves to the other, they are essentially deceiving with their bodies. Now, the traditional Catholic objection to contraception had to do with the fact that it interfered with the generative aspect of sex, and thus disrespected its teleology. What JP2 and Paul VI brought out was that it also interfered and even nullified the unitive meaning of the act. By artificially preventing the possibility of conception, the couple were withholding a part of themselves from each other, and thus, rather than being a total self-gift, it would be in some sense a selfish act entered into for pleasure, which would mean, thus, using the other person for personal gratification. It would be, to use the Kantian terminology that JP2's personalism descended from, to treat your sexual partner as a means to an end, that is to say, a means to the end of personal sexual gratification, rather than an end in themselves. You're entering it basically for yourself rather than for them. The objection that a couple can still give each other completely to one another in a psychological way fails because it's too Cartesian and Gnostic. We are not merely minds inhabiting bodies, we are minds and bodies. And the act of contracepting is for that reason an intrinsically disordered and selfish act because of how it uses the body. There's also something selfish about it because children, and even the possibility of children, pull people out of themselves, not only towards the child, but also towards each other. The case of Theo and Julian would seem to confirm this.
It's hard for me to look at you. He had your eyes.
Now, I really invite you to reflect on this, even if you end up coming to a different conclusion than I do. If you think, or are even willing to believe, that sex would largely lose its appeal or at least its significance if children were impossible, doesn't that suggest that the purpose and the meaning of sex is the possibility of childbirth? If you think it's also for the purpose of expressing love, which it is, ask yourself, do you think it would be as effective as an expression of love if there was no possibility of childbirth? I don't just mean if childbirth were impossible for that specific couple, but if it were impossible generally, if that's no longer what it signified. If sex were totally divorced from childbirth in a general sense, if it lost its generative meaning, it would also lose its unitive power. And sure enough, the rise of divorce seems to suggest that as sex becomes less and less about childbirth, it loses more and more of its power to unite. And the case of Theo and Julian suggests why. They no longer have anything to concretize their love. Now conversely, if we still affirm the generative purpose of sex, then we can say that the conjugal act, even between a sterile couple, is still a reproductive sort of act, even if it doesn't lead to a pregnancy. The infertile couple would be a damaged example of still respecting the telos of the conjugal act in the way that a bird with a broken wing still trying to fly is an example of something trying to fulfill its telos. Now, I put this forward for your consideration. In the movie source material, people have largely lost interest in sex to the point where the government has to try to generate eroticism in the population by opening porn shops. I remember when I first read the book, I went around asking people whether they thought sex would be more or less common if pregnancy was impossible. Pretty uniformly, I was told that people would be having sex more often, since, other than STDs, it would be basically consequence-free. But this raises the same question that hangs over everything else in this world. What's the point? If it strikes you as plausible that people would in fact lose interest in sex, doesn't that suggest that in some fundamental sense, the telos of sexuality is childbirth, and that we should therefore respect that. And moreover, if sex should always be at least of the procreative sort, and the purpose of marriage is to facilitate childbearing, as Bertrand Russell points out, doesn't that suggest that sex is intended for and best accomplishes its purpose within the marital context? Now, it's true that Key indicates that she has sex so wantonly and carelessly that she doesn't even keep track of most of her partner's names. But this is in a certain sense the same phenomena as outright loss of interest in or attraction to sex. In both cases, the conjugal act has lost its magic, its specialness, its meaningfulness, to the point where, as G.E. Manscombe prophesied would happen after the use of contraception became widespread, sex is nothing more than a, quote, extreme kiss, end quote. Disrespecting it by abuse or by indifference both spring from that same root of disenchantment. I note in passing that in our culture too, a culture of asexuality has sprung up, consisting of people loud and proud about the fact that sex just doesn't interest them. You can make of that what you will, but it seems to me that a culture so hypersexualized must produce people who are just turned off by sex after a while from sheer overexposure to it. Humanae Vitae was naturally not well received, but it predicted certain social consequences of widespread acceptance of contraception. It warns, for example, that it might lead men to lose respect for women and begin to see them merely as sex toys. It's hard to claim that this didn't come dramatically true, and it's also hard to claim that this isn't a major reason why the divorce rate is so high. On the very same page from Marriage and Morals that I quoted earlier, Bertrand Russell claims, "It seems absurd to ask people to enter upon a relationship intended to be lifelong without any previous knowledge as to their sexual compatibility. It is just as absurd as if a man intending to buy a house were not allowed to view it until he had completed the purchase." Now, notice that he doesn't factor in the fact that this is two fully free persons lovingly giving themselves fully to each other. He uses the analogy of a guy appraising something, notice, that he plans to use for his own purposes, as an object of convenience, who needs to check it out before he can decide whether it best conforms to how he wants to use it. This is a cynical, calculating, exploitative, and objectifying approach to marriage beyond anything you'd find in even a culture that believes in arranged marriage. And it's no wonder that such a selfish definition of marriage has led to a general breakdown in marital longevity, and in general respect for the opposite sex. The Pope also warned that totalitarian governments might use contraceptions to control their populations. Now, again, JP2 promulgated his theology of the body after witnessing decades of totalitarian oppression of his native Poland, and as one who would go on to be renowned for his work in bringing down communism. This is not unrelated to his theology of the body. I think he perceived the connection between a full affirmation of humanity as the bearer of God's image and the resistance of tyrannical usurpers. This is maybe another subject, but it's worthwhile to quote C.S. Lewis, who pointed out that the belief in the soul's immortality is the difference between totalitarianism and democracy. As he writes in Mere Christianity, if individuals live only 70 years, then a state, or a nation, or a civilization, which may last for 1,000 years, is more important than an individual. But if Christianity is true, then the individual is not only more important, but incomparably more important, for he is everlasting, and the life of a state or a civilization, compared with his, is only a moment. George Orwell said much the same thing. He was aware that what he called machine civilization posed a lot of dangerous and threatening problems, and the scariest part of it was that the belief in personal immortality was dwindling. Now, he didn't even believe in personal immortality, nor did he want to go back to it, but he appreciated that its absence left a gaping hole where morality once existed, which left the state free to grow into the big brother that he had envisioned. The traditional Catholic teaching on sexual morality is part and parcel of a theology which puts the human front and center as an end in itself. It is thus the rejection of any overweening statism that sacrifices persons to ideology. And the very fact that observing this morality involves a degree of asceticism, self-mastery, and restraint of your passions is actually another check against Big Brother. In Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, the state controls people entirely by pleasuring them into indifference, and specifically by giving every woman a pack of contraceptives known as a Malthus belt. This ends up destroying the concept of exclusive fidelity and prevents any marriages, let alone families or any other societies independent of the state, from having any chance of forming. Interestingly, at one point, one of the dictators comments that, quote, "Industrial civilization is only possible when there's no self-denial." End quote. This is a movie renowned among advocates of social justice and global development, and the DVD comes complete with a documentary with a bunch of leftist talking heads telling us all about the problems with the world. Now, pro-lifers will point out that the left wing claims to stand up for the rights of the oppressed, but ignores the destruction of the smallest and most vulnerable human beings in the womb. This is true, but it actually doesn't go far enough. The Pope writes that, quote, "authentic human development concerns the whole of the person in every single dimension," end quote. But if we haven't actually defined authentic personhood, how can we have a guide as to how to develop the world? As the scripture says, "Where there is no vision, the people perish." And this, the Holy Father reminds us, has to be defined with reference to an eternal vantage point. Quote, "Without the perspective of eternal life, human progress in this world is denied breathing space," unquote. And this would seem to corroborate the insights of Lewis and Orwell. For example, this is obviously a movie that deals with the injustices of the oppression of so-called illegal immigrants. The director is a Mexican, and he clearly feels strongly about this topic. Now, the Catholic Church has often stood up for the rights of undocumented immigrants, which of course any leftist would appreciate, but this stance is inseparable from its position on sexual morality because they both come from an integrated vision of respecting the human person. In the same vein, consider the Pope's comments about how condom use in Africa was actually making the problem of HIV worse. Now, people largely forgot about that comment after he later made a remark about condom use that was widely misinterpreted as a softening of the Church's position, but at that time there was a storm of controversy about the supposed possible harm that would result from the Pope's remarks. Disregarding the fact that the data verified what he was saying, consider the actual thrust of his commentary. Dumping a bunch of condoms onto Africa has a bit of a give a man a fish and he'll feed for a day kind of feel to it. HIV prevention programs that stress abstinence and fidelity over condom use are not only more effective, but also more respectful of the human person, because they develop virtues like patience, restraint, maturity, and basically the whole program of human development that comes from a true humanist vision. It's, if you will, teaching a man to fish. But this would require the first world dedicate itself to helping to build a society where values like unselfishness and restraint are really highly valued, but the first world itself is characterized by selfishness and indulgence. In children of men, selfishness flows out of infertility, but in reality it may be the other way around. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks accuses Europeans of being too selfish to have children, because raising a family takes a lot of self-denial and patience that our materialist culture doesn't value. The problem with the secular liberal society so many activists want to build is that it's questionable whether they'll be able to raise up a next generation to sustain that culture, whereas more traditional societies, such as Muslim-dominated countries, are effortlessly outbreeding them. Rabbi Sacks draws on Albert Camus' claim that the central question of philosophy is whether or not I should commit suicide, but he rephrases Camus' question by saying that the real issue is should I have children? And indeed, Europe can be seen as committing cultural suicide by not breeding a next generation, by collectively swallowing a quietus pill. Rabbi Sacks attributes this to Europe's lack of religious values and increasing secularism, and this was a topic T.S. Eliot wrote much about. His poetry shows a darkening concern with both his own personal mortality and with the spiritual barrenness of the culture in general, which can be seen in works like The Hollow Man and The Wasteland. He ended up finding hope in Christian conversion, and his change in attitude can be seen in poems he wrote about the Nativity, like The Journey of the Magi or Song for Simeon. The last lines of The Wasteland are shanty, 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 a Sanskrit chant that he translates as peace that passes understanding. His translation quotes Philippians 4 verse 7, where St. Paul says that it's Christ who brings the peace of God which passes all understanding. This phrase recurs in the movie Children of Men, once at the Christ-like death of Julian, once at Jasper's excitement about Key's pregnancy.
Feed her for me, Theo. Key, your baby is the miracle the whole world's been waiting for. Shanty, shanty, shanty. Come on. Shanty, shanty, shanty.
And finally at the end of the movie. But where does this movie think that peace beyond all understanding can come from? Where is the possibility of hope to be found? The discovery of some agent of salvation is a common theme in the post-apocalyptic movies. In all three incarnations of I Am Legend, it was the healing blood of the last man on Earth that would end the spread of a vampire virus and create a new race of humanity. In The Road, it was a metaphorical fire of hope that the father tried to pass on to his son, a theme that also appeared in Cormac McCarthy's novel No Country for Old Men and its film adaptation. In the Book of Eli, it was the Bible which offered the possibility of a faith upon which society could be rebuilt. Here, of course, it is a miraculous birth to an African girl named Key. I mentioned before that we have to define the human person before we can understand the human project. The Christian claim is that God became incarnate in Jesus Christ and showed us the perfect standard of what humanity is destined to become, and then made it possible to achieve this ideal of the image of God by being conformed to Jesus in Christian conversion. Here what we see is a girl with a meaningful name, Key. She is the key to the understanding and salvation of the human race. The director made her African in reference to the discovery of scientists that the human race originated in Africa. 2012 also has the human race going back to the source, back to Africa, to rebuild the world from there. Key is the movie's Virgin Mary and her Eve. Her Simeon, the old man who gives the child its blessing before he dies, is Jasper Palmer. Saint Simeon had a word from God that he would see the Messiah before he died. Jasper merely saw a UFO. His wife Janice is the movie's version of Saint Anna, who is given no dialogue in the Bible and thus has no dialogue in this film. Jasper and Miriam have a conversation at one point that gives us some clue about the possibility of hope.
Wicked. So, you've got faith over here, right? And chance over there.
And yin and yang.
Sort of.
Oh, Shiva and Shakti.
Lennon and McCartney.
Look, Julian and Theo.
Yeah, there you go. Julian and Theo met among a million protesters in a rally by chance. But they were there because of what they believed in the first place, their faith. They wanted to change the world, and their faith kept them together. But by chance, Dylan was born.
This is him?
Yeah, that's it. He'd have been about your age, magical child. Beautiful. Their faith put in praxis.
Praxis? What happened?
Chance. It was their sweet little dream. He had little hands, little legs, little feet, little lungs. And in 2008, along came the flu pandemic. And then by chance, he was gone.
Oh, Jesus.
You see, Theo's faith lost out to chance. So, why bother if life's going to make its own choices?
Watch out, baby's got Theo's eyes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's terrible. But you know, everything happens for a reason.
That I don't know. But Theo and Julian would always bring Dylan.
Now, I have to say that I find something a bit unsatisfying about Jasper's commentary here. It seems to almost pit faith against reality, as if faith is a commitment you stick by even in the face of the randomness and mercilessness of the fates. It seems to me that faith is only virtuous when it's a trusting acceptance of some sort of assurance. It should correspond to an objective order of reality, not merely struggle against it. Faith worth standing by would be faith in a word from above that says that there is no chance, that there is a plan behind everything, as Miriam says. The Christian has faith in his own resurrection because he heard this gospel preached to him, and it is confirmed by the objective, historical, and literal resurrection of Jesus from the dead. The passion narratives that culminate in the resurrection story assure us that the suffering and apparent chaos in the world are actually destined for a glorious and redemptive eschaton. This is the source of our hope, but what about in the movie? Hope, of course, is symbolized by Key's baby, so it seems fair to ask where the baby came from. Who is the father? The movie never tells us, which is synecdoche of its entire portrayal of God as present and yet perennially hidden. But in the novel, the situation is very different. In the book, Julian is the mother, and the leader of the Fishes is her husband and the child's presumed father, Rolf. Luke is a priest and member of the Fishes. Julian is a Christian who celebrates Mass with Luke, but Rolf believes in nothing. At the end of one chapter, Theo wonders whether Rolf doesn't continue to nurture a superstition that Luke, as a priest, can turn dead bread and wine into the living flesh of Christ. In the next chapter, Luke is revealed to be the baby's real father, and in a run-in with a gang, he gives his life to save the others. The miraculous conception, therefore, is an act of transubstantiation. Here the Catholic doctrine of the Mass should be briefly explained. Roughly summarized, St. Anselm of Canterbury explained that God became man because human sin had offended God's honor and kindled his wrath. But Christ's perfect sacrifice appeased his Father's anger and restored his honor, enabling him to forgive sin. Now, that's a very crude, oversimplified, anthropomorphic explanation of it, but it gets the job done for our purposes. Moreover, the sufferings voluntarily offered up by holy men and women, usually in the context of martyrdom for their faith, joined to the meritorious suffering of Christ, created a treasury of merit that could be used to intercede to the Father on a sinner's behalf. This is the basis of the practice of granting indulgences. With those hastily explained theological concepts in mind, consider that the only explanation given in this movie for the universal infertility is that it's God's punishment for sin. Now, I'm sure it's fundamentalists who assert it, but nobody comes up with a better explanation, and the title seems to confirm it. P.D. James got her title from Psalm 90, verse 3. Thou turnest man to destruction, and sayest, Return, ye children of men. God is the one sending man to his grave in this verse, and perhaps in this story, and the idea that his wrath needs to be appeased by suffering is not unheard of in this culture.
What about the one we had lunch with, Lauren?
Lorna, that was ages ago.
Oh, I like her. What happened?
She decided to renounce.
Renounces? Are those the ones that kneel down for a month for salvation?
No, they're the repenters. The renouncers flagellate themselves for the forgiveness of humanity.
Oh, right. Dating ain't what it used to be, is it, amigo?
But what's interesting is that in this society that's so characterized by selfishness, so many people commit the ultimate selfless act and give their lives to secure a future for Key and her baby. From Julian to Jasper to Miriam to Marika to Theo. These are martyrs upon whose sacrifices built the foundation for the new humanity that will come from Key's womb, and perhaps from them comes the treasury of merit that wins the favor of God. But these little crucifixions are all part of the general resurrection. The pregnancy itself is a kind of resurrection of humanity, but it's also a spiritual resurrection for Key herself.
Who's the father?
We fed. I'm a virgin.
Sorry?
Child, be wicked, eh?
Yeah, it would.
Fuck knows. I don't know most of the wankers' names. You know, when I started puking, thought I catch the pest, but then my belly started getting big. Nobody ever told me these things. I never seen a pregnant woman before, but I knew. I felt like a freak. I didn't tell nobody. I thought about the quietest thing. It's supposed to be suave, pretty music and all that. Then the baby kicked. I feel it. Little bastard was alive, and I feel it, and me too. I am alive.
Question. Does Key's pregnancy make her feel more alive because it's more scarce, because it's rare, and because it's amazing that she has a baby? Or is there something about pregnancy itself that is inherently life-giving, inherently rejuvenating? Of course, there's an obvious agenda behind why I asked that question, so I'll move on. And I will point out that the word Qi is the traditional Chinese word for a life force, for the active principle forming part of any living thing, to rip off Wikipedia directly. But the most definitive resurrection story in the movie is the personal redemption of Theo Farron. Theo, of course, began as a political idealist who burned out and became a bureaucrat.
I'm speaking to the people. And they're joining us, Theo. British people, too.
I don't talk politics.
It's all you ever used to do.
That was 20 years ago. I'm a lot more successful now.
Jasper calls him a rebel with a lost cause, but interestingly, it doesn't seem like he's utterly sold his soul. One of the interesting things about a movie apparently so beloved by environmentalists is the absence of any strong environmentalist themes. It seems like in this world, we actually ended up solving the environmental crisis. All the cars and children of men seem eco-friendly, and there are trees everywhere. The environment seems to be doing really well. And this is an interesting and subtle point. Theo works for the Ministry of Energy. He presumably played some sort of role in this positive development. And interestingly, he never uses a gun in this movie. His weapons of choice always seem to be car-related, whether it's car doors or car batteries. Now, again, for a movie made in our political climate, it's fascinating to me that at no point in the movie does anyone deny that the human race dying out would be a bad thing. Nobody goes on any Agent Smith-style rants about how humans are a disease on the body of Mother Earth and she'll be a lot better off without us. It seems to be just taken for granted that human survival is good and positive, and maybe that's because it takes a legitimately humanist view, that we are capable of stewarding the Earth in a just and fitting way. Anyway, the point is that while Theo hasn't totally lost his spark of social conscience, he's definitely done his best to smother it under the dreariness of his boring and aloof lifestyle. He seems to have lost his vigor for life or desire to save the world when his son Dylan died, and he tries to hide behind his suicidal habit of cigarette smoking from ever getting actively involved in the world again. But actually, at no point in the movie does he ever finish a cigarette. He keeps getting pulled away from it by his responsibilities, whether it's going into the barn to discover Key's pregnancy, or whether he's too overcome by grief over Julian's death to burn away the pain this time. The man can't let himself opt out anymore, and the reality of this baby and the renewal of hope fire him up to become the reckless and dedicated hero that he once aspired to be. Key's gesture of naming her baby Dylan, the same name that Theo and Julian had given their child, is a symbolic resurrection of Theo's hopes and dreams as embodied in his own child, and it also makes him the symbolic father of her child. Since the name Theo is Greek for God, this does make the baby the son of God, and it's worth mentioning that the surname Theron means lighthouse, while the name Dylan means born from the sea, and it is of course on a boat that he gets his name. And this is how the movie ends, with the prospect of a new humanity based on the sacrifice of God and the success of the human project and their ship, the Tomorrow. I love how this film feels important, even though it's clearly not pretentious. I love how it's understated, and it's not exactly epic, but it has a grandeur to it. It has a kind of understated, subtle importance that permeates everything. I love the actors. I love their performances. I love the drama they bring to it. I love the depth that's inherent in it. I love the way it's shot. I love the color scheme, how it feels earthy, how it feels authentic. The only thing I'd say doesn't really work is the humor, which is out of place and doesn't really work. But other than that, this is just about a flawless movie. And not only that, but it's filled with imagery. It's very, very layered and dense. I've talked about a lot of it, but there are images that really affect me, and I don't know what the hell they mean. And that's a real strength of the thing. It's not didactic, but it very easily fits into your tradition. And it, like I said, it does demand you to fit it into both your immediate cultural tradition and your wider intellectual tradition. I mean, the name Dylan and the fact that Michael Caine is clearly channeling John Lennon call upon you to summon all your 70s leftist idealism, but the fact that it uses so much religious imagery calls upon you to go deep into your psyche and into your heart to really deal with whether you believe that God is looking out for us. And as somebody who does, I find this movie incredibly affirmative. I feel very hopeful at the end of every time I watch it. It never gets old for me. I've lost track of how many times I've watched it since 2006. I intend to watch it several more times. And with any luck, 50 years from now, or even less than that, perhaps when we're the characters' ages in this film, I think this should be a Christmas classic, and I encourage all of you to watch it this holiday season. And thank you very much for watching.
They shall praise thee and suffer in every generation, with glory and derision, light upon light, mounting the saints' stair. Not for me the martyrdom, the ecstasy of thought and prayer, not for me the ultimate vision. Grant me thy peace, and a sword shall pierce thy heart, thine also. I am tired with my own life and the lives of those after me. I am dying in my own death and the deaths of those after me. Let thy servant depart, having seen thy salvation.